My name's Cameron Hurta. God did a really spectacular thing in October of 2018, so just almost a year ago. So I was leaving a Bible study from Declaration Church way out on Highway 6, and I was about to exit the church. And I was sitting there making sure that no one was going to drive past me and I wouldn't hit them. But this girl changed lanes from an off-ramp to Highway 6. And I don't know if she overcorrected or what happened, but we collided and she hit the driver's side of my car right like 3 feet in front of where I sit. And I just remember when that happened, time froze. And I just in front of me saw this horrible scene play out. It was her in this tiny red car flipping 3 times and then rolling through the ditch of the church and landing in the entrance road to the church. And I pulled over and got out, and I was stunned. She was driving over 65, even though the speed limit, I don't know, it was probably around there. But with such a high impact like that, I couldn't believe that I was still alive. Part of me thought I was dead and dreaming the rest of this. And I got out and I ran over to her, and her car's upside down and then it rolls to be right side up again. And this girl steps out and doesn't have a scratch on her. And I was like, oh my gosh, are you okay? And she just starts screaming. I was on the phone with my dad. And everyone from my Bible study was still at church, and they just heard this raucous smash and they come running over. And by that time, there's a whole group there. And this girl didn't have a single scratch on her. We found her phone. It was thrown about 30 feet toward the church, and her dad was still on the phone. So her dad heard all of the accident. So we were waiting for the EMS and the police to arrive, and she was pretty hysterical, understandably. And I have high functioning Asperger's, which means I have a sensory processing disorder, which means that sometimes if there is sort of an injection of too much sensory stimulus at once, my body will sort of shut down and go into what looks like seizures. Even though they're not epileptic, I will pass out and collapse and just start kind of having seizures. And once the EMS and the fire truck arrived and the lights, I think that is when I sort of just had it. And I saw her being carried up to the EMS just to be checked out. And then I looked at my pastor, who was like my dad, and he was like, "Hey, Cam, you're doing really well." And I was like, "No, I'm really not." And I just collapsed and passed out in the road. And the next thing I remember, I'm in the emergency room, and my pastor guy's there, and the girl who was hit or who's in the accident as well was in the room right next to us. And I was very drugged at this point, and I was like, what happened? And because she got to the ER before I did, my pastor guy was able to go speak to her and her family before he came to my room. And Travis, the pastor, came over and he said, "Well, Cam, you got to hear about this." And I, in my drugged state, was very excited. I was like, "All right, Travi, tell me what's up." And that's when he said the girl who had been in the accident with me, her mom had left the family about 2 or 3 years ago, and her dad said that she hadn't been taking the transition to college very well. She had just started partying, was really hanging out with some really bad people, and her boyfriend was kind of leading her down a path that she wasn't comfortable with herself, and her dad wasn't okay with. And she kind of grew up, according to Travis, she kind of grew up relatively Christian, but all that kind of faded away when her mom left. And her dad had been talking to her for months, trying to get her to go back to a church or just push her toward God again. And she just wasn't having it. So her dad, and the only response that he knew how, was to ask God to bring her back to him. And he'd been praying for her for 7 months. And when she was in the accident, not only did she land in the entryway to a church and have no scratches on her whatsoever, after her car rolled 3 times, both of her cars were totaled. She didn't have a single injury on her. She landed in the entry road to the church, but the road that our church was on, that she landed on, was Damascus Road. So the road where Paul had his conversion experience. So it was incredible just to see God's providence and the fact that we both lived through that. And last time I talked to Travis about it, she'd actually been attending the church for a couple of weeks. I never met her after the accident. I don't know her name anymore. I wasn't able to catch up with her. But it was just astounding to see that we both survived that situation with no scratches to either of us. Everything was perfectly fine. And God used that situation to blatantly put her in a situation where he was calling her back to him. So if there's a prodigal son, prodigal daughter story out there, I mean, this is like one of them.
Yeah.
But so it was really incredible. I was let out of the ER about 4 a.m. And I was still very, very groggy. And I woke up the next morning and went to like a guy's Bible study hangout the next night. And I was like, man, I'm not feeling so hot. And I walked out of the front door and I like collapsed on the front porch. And I stopped breathing for 2 minutes, and the EMS was called. It was the same paramedics from the day before. And they did so many chest rubs to try to get me to respond that 2 days later, this whole area here was black and green and bruised. I was taken to the ER again, and they didn't diagnose me with epilepsy. They did tests to try to figure it out. They figured out that what was happening was some sort of seizure activity. They had no idea what was happening or why it was happening. And at that point in the year, we were in the same class. We had a huge essay midterm due, and I was also like in an ethical theory class where I had a 15-page essay due in there as well. And I just was so stressed. And the like partial points I remember being conscious, the only thing I could think about was, oh snot, I've got so much to do. But that sort of set off, that event sort of really set off these like seizures. And for the next several months, I started having them like relatively regularly. But they eventually morphed into like kind of a weird spiritual kind of thing at the end, which is probably a different story for a different day. But I really learned that I have to be okay with it just being me and God, because in those moments I felt like a freak. Like I felt like I was like the victim and everyone was having to care for me. And I don't like that. I'm a very independent person. And I didn't like all my friends looking at me like I was a ticking time bomb, that I was gonna like pass out and die on their front porch one day. And that really taught me that I really need to depend on God in everything and make sure that my confidence isn't coming from how my friends view me. And I can still be confident in Christ, even if my friends aren't viewing me how they maybe should. It's been a crazy year because of some other things that happened with the seizures going on. It's just, this might be a little bit of a rant, but I got my Aggie ring this weekend and everyone's excited about getting their Aggie ring. And I I couldn't really afford it. And then I looked one day and I got the Aggie ring scholarship and I was like, oh my gosh, it was 20 minutes after I looked and decided I wasn't gonna buy it because I couldn't afford it. I got the email that I got my entire ring paid for. But when I got my ring, I remember I was borderline crying in all the professional pictures, because to me, it wasn't symbolic of like my journey at Texas A&M. To me, it was symbolic of all the people who were there at the ring ceremony for me. It was really just a way of God reminding me of how far he's brought me and the people that he put in my life through such strange circumstances in any way else. And that while I may be a senior at Texas A&M now, that this has all been a journey in my relationship with God and Christ. And it was really just nice to look back on it and just have the ring as a reminder of all the crazy things that God has done in my college life. So.
Thank you so much for watching our Behold video series. We are so excited to see how God uses these videos to glorify his kingdom. So if you have a story, or if you know other people who have a story, please feel free to contact me at this email address, because we would love to hear how God has changed your life.